Okay, so we are here for actually the last panel of our conference. It's the closing panel, and it is about science and literature and opera. And the first presenter we have is Lutz, who is now at the Universität Magdeburg. And he's a physicist, actually. So we do have a scientist among us. And his presentation is very interesting, and it's about opera. And the title is Running Out of Time, Einstein on the Beach Beyond the Limits of Motion. He will play also a short clip for us within it. And Tyler, I just leave the floor to you.
All right, thank you, Anna, and thanks to everyone else who is responsible for this really beautiful conference. I've enjoyed it quite a lot. I'm going to offer some thoughts on an opera that might or might not be one. I'm going to leave it to your discretion to decide. Act 1, Scene 2 of Einstein on the Beach is set in a stylized courtroom where an enormous armless clock looms over the judicial bench. The denuded clock offers a hint at what justice might look like in the atomic age. We've seen too much to continue striving towards blind justice, but timeless justice maybe yet be within our reach. There's a problem. The judges, it turns out, are buffoons. The clock face is quickly eclipsed by an unexpected solar eclipse. And those clock arms, they're everywhere. From this conspicuously well-dressed interloper to the jury, these actors in a later intermezzo, and most notably maybe to the conductor, to the arms of the conductor in the opening scene. So it's 3 o'clock here. The difficulty of navigating Einstein's sprawling subterranean network of dimly lit associational pathways is what makes it both an obdurately frustrating and ultimately deeply fulfilling work to witness. Einstein on the Beach remains an intensely polarizing work, eliciting reactions ranging from dismay at its agonizing minimalism to awe at the sense of mystical significance it inspires. Neither extreme bears easy dismissal. If Einstein's motions are indeed agonizingly simple, it's only because they evade easy taxonomization. Its movements glide effortlessly between different domains of motion, flitting in and out of legibility and resurfacing in surprising places. It's precisely the distance between these two poles of mysticism and monotony that supplies the high voltage setting the whole work in motion. As Isabel Danto writes of the piece, quote, "One can no longer speak but of flows, of tensions, of equilibria, of zones of intensity, multiplication of time, of images in motion, and after John Cage and Marcel Duchamp, of transformations of vision and of perception. It is by these means that this work escapes time and remains a perpetual work in progress." Einstein is an opera on the move, staging the confluence of a stunning diversity of disparate orders of movement that continually revise, qualify, and creatively reimagine each other. It's at once a musical composition by Philip Glass, a choreographed dance piece by Lucinda Childs, all rolled together into a work of musical theater by Robert Wilson, and set in motion by the kinetic affordances of the natural scientific theories laid out by its titular figure. It refuses to be boxed in by easy analytic framings, and as Craig Owens remarks of its images, evinces a presentational immediacy that renders it resistant to analysis. So heterogeneous are the means and effects of its inoculated dimensions of motion that tracking how the work's different degrees of freedom, to put it suggestively, relate to each other becomes one of the central hermeneutic challenges posed by Einstein on the Beach. How does motion, in other words, move through the piece? I think there might be two broad approaches to this question of movement in Einstein. One might involve inferring a core set of gestural conceits underlying the work, kinetic ideas that are variously interpreted and realized in the choreography, the score, the staging. So the pointing gesture that I just mentioned might be one such motif that could be tracked across the work's nested strata. But the obverse is also possible. We could just as well ask how the larger motion the piece stages ramifies out into its various appendages. We can imagine its innumerable choreographed, orchestrated, and staged motions as independent and yet interwoven strands of the same common kinetic fabric. Gestural ideas are transiently conjured up around its many axes of motion and then radiate outwards from them in interacting turbulent cascades. The penultimate spaceship scene is a paradigmatic example of this, as is the opening train scene. In both of them, the dancers, the music, and the set design all participate in the shared kinetic motifs of the spaceship and the train, respectively. Here is the train scene. I just want to point out a few things here. One, I think, is a nifty little pun on the word conductor. So we have, of course, the train, which is the canonical train that shows up in Einsteinian thought experiments and relativity, which has a conductor. We have a literal musical conductor, which might or might not be embodied by this guy on the right here. We have this triangular wire in the middle and this bar of light across the top, which for me at least, evoke electrical conductors. I think there's something really special about the way that this piece can take a simple idea and explore all of its different facets. So for instance, in the upper left-hand side of the stage, we see a boy holding light, the idea of light as something corporeal, something as an object. In later scenes, actually this is earlier in the same scene, there's fog that pervades the stage, turning space itself into something that could potentially fill space as something that has presence and is an object itself. Glass suggestively labels the short interludes between acts as, quote, knee plays, entertaining the idea of the corporeality of the opera as a whole, variously articulated and modulated by the many bodies on stage. Another example of this collective motion is to be found in Dance 2, which starts with the simple idea of locality. I'm just going to try to share this. Voilà. So I think the starting point here is the idea of locality, an Einsteinian idea that motion can only be communicated to nearest neighbors, and transforms it into ideas of both music and choreography. I'll just give you about 30 seconds of this. All right, I hope you haven't gone insane yet. If not, there's another 4.5 hours. Here we go. So I think here we have to resist the temptation to say either that the dancers are realizing through dance the score's wave-like musical ideas, or that the score is somehow mining the dancers. Both of these sets of motion are embodying and conveying disparate facets of the same underlying undulations, which, if you notice in the way that the stage was set up, all seem to emanate out of Einstein's violin. What I find so fascinating about how the work's movements diffuse across its many registers is that it exemplifies how Einstein on the beach fluidly drifts between putatively incommensurable discursive domains, disparate art worlds, and viewing publics. To even begin talking about it, we almost necessarily have to take some disciplinary stance. So commentators are apt to write about Glass's Einstein on the beach, or Wilson's Einstein on the beach, or Child's Einstein on the beach, almost never all three of them in the same breath. Such disciplinary points of view are well adapted to bringing technical details to light, but poorly suited to elaborating how the work is a composite of very different sorts of motion, stages in miniature, the clash of worlds that structures our cultural engagement with science. What language, after all, do we have to speak of abstract gestural ideas that wouldn't already force them into the strictures of, for instance, the embodied movement of a dancer, or mathematical theorem of mechanics? This is a fundamental methodological issue raised by the work. And in what follows, I posit that Einstein's motion can't be looked at head on, but instead is only legible if viewed from the corner of the eye. I'd thus like to take the perspective that the work is not engaged in an act of representing or embodying relativistic physics, but rather that it stages the process of engagement with Einsteinian science. It promiscuously shuttles between borrowing, extending, subverting, and reimagining kinetic motifs from the natural sciences. What the piece explores in the end is not Einsteinian physics per se, but rather the full field of motive possibilities, many of them strictly inconsistent, that the physics opens up to our imagination. Einstein is a programmatic work of minimalism, and its minimalist aesthetics diffuses everything from its compositional technique to its set design and choreography. Even the relativistic conception of motion at the core of the work's thematic content is reimagined according to a minimalist rubric. So after Einstein, we know that gravity doesn't need to be posited ad hoc. We know that the parabolic arc of a projectile is just the three-dimensional illusion of a straight trajectory moving in curved four-dimensional spacetime. Rather than try to hold the work's mercurial fractal movements in focus, I'd like to take an oblique tack and ask how motion is variously resolved and occluded by its implication in two of the work's most salient problematics: its plural and tortuously interwoven formal composition, and its complex relationship to the possibility of transcendental meaning. In order to begin grappling with the transmedial enormity of the work, I find it helpful to read Einstein alongside Samuel Beckett's Quad 1 and 2 and Nacht und Träume. These are two short TV plays that aired in 1981 and 1983, respectively. This is Nacht und Träume, just a few stills. I'll say more about this later, but what basically happens here is this actor performs some basic motions that grow and build upon each other. This is quad 1, in which these dancers or players move about the stage in a pre-programmed pattern, which, unless you stare at it long enough, looks more or less random. Just for comparison, this is the way that Lucinda Childs diagrammed a different work that she choreographed. So this is not Einstein on the Beach, but I think you can see some similar sense of repeated patterns and geometric patterns. And here we go back to the Nacht und Träume of Einstein on the Beach. Franz Meyer identifies in Nacht und Träume, quote, a concept of repetition characterized by an aspect of modification as opposed to mechanical doubling. Movements in the work grow out of and constantly build upon each other, echoing Glass's compositional method, which he calls the additive process, by which simple musical threads are repeated and gradually modulated over time. In his essay, L'Épuisé, Deleuze provides a reading of such gradual modulations as constituting an act of exhaustion, a condition he contrasts to the merely tired, in that the exhausted is, quote, not passive. It presses on, but towards nothing. In what might as well be a remark on Einstein on the Beach, Deleuze indexes, quote, the greatest exactitude and the most extreme indeterminacy, the indefinite exchange of mathematical formulations, and the pursuit of the formless and the unformulated. These are the two senses of exhaustion, and both are necessary in order to abolish the real. End quote. In the way it obstinately chews melodic lines and choreographic conceits into a pulp, Einstein is technically exhaustive, and yet it never really runs out of steam. In fact, it's precisely the haze that always seems to be hovering just above the stage that prevents the work from realizing the condition of the exhausted. So by haze, I mean the literal smoke that I showed you before. Also this kind of monochromatic blue color palette, which makes all the objects seem to kind of blur into each other. Proximally, this haze is the exhaust of trains and spaceships, the work stages, but it connotes more than that. It stands at once for the inscrutability of Einstein's ideas, it marks the work's mythic imaginary, and finally, it's the ethical haze that descends upon us at the dawn of the New World Order, the atomic age. The empty chair at the work's opening scene and the omnipresent haze not only foreground the lack of presence, but make absence itself into a kind of presence. As the dancers move about stage, their movements ramify into the pervading fog as shudders and eddies of spacetime. It's not hard to imagine the music, which ostensibly sets the rhythm for all of their motion, as itself dynamically adapting to, maybe even predicting the dancer's motions. It's exactly by persistently and dynamically altering movements enabling conditions that Einstein avoids the trap of the merely tired. Its figuration of space as an active player in its own microcosm serves as the work's pressure relief, exploding the possibilities of motion right at the moment when all motion seems to have been exhausted. I think there's a science historic commentary here of Einstein's ideas, of the historical Einstein's ideas as the ever-present horizon for novel prospects for motion and understanding. In Einstein's case, of course, it's black holes, time travel, light rays traversing unfathomable distances without even aging a nanosecond. But there's a possibility always for something more that I think Einstein represents. Einstein on the Beach boldly positions itself as a participant in that something more. All of this brings me to the question of meaning in Einstein on the Beach. Not necessarily what the work means in some transcendental sense, but rather how its movements variously activate and eclipse questions of meaning. The issue of meaning is a well-rehearsed fixture in Einstein on the Beach's critical reception. So Bernard Holland in 2007 wrote, Einstein on the Beach is the ideal entertainment for people smart enough not to think too much. Another castigates the work as, quote, lacking even the sophistication to raise it even into the class of the primitive. Most damning of all might be Veronica Hollinger's 1988 remarks, quote, it may be that much postmodern performance art is fiddling with spectacle instead of critically engaging in our contemporary situation, allying itself to, rather than resisting the postmodern cult of the simulacrum, becoming in the process a neo-avant-garde, which is in fact neoconservative. Poised within the hypnotic repetitions of Philip Glass's minimalist score, the images of scientist and spaceship on the stage of Einstein on the Beach are, finally, passive, drained of their ability to mirror any reality outside of their own reality. End quote. Einstein's frantic movements are, in other words, a mere cover for political passivity. Such criticisms hint possibly at something deeper. It's not always obvious whether they're ultimately directed at the operatic work or at the scientific ideas it represents. So the tension that Hollinger points to might between spectacle and a reactionary, even actively destructive politics is one that could be equally well said of the physics of the period. In his book, Music by Philip Glass, a retrospective account of the portrait trilogy of which Einstein on the Beach is the opening work, Glass cites the uncanniness of his experience of the, quote, emphatic, if catastrophic, beginning of the nuclear age, coupled to his childhood admiration for the gentle, almost saint-like originator of the theory that enabled it, as having initially sparked his and Wilson's interest in centering the opera on Einstein. Though the 1976 premiere of Einstein on the Beach postdates the publication of Einstein's most seminal contributions to physics by more than half a century, the opera nevertheless emerged in a historical moment in which ideas about the meaning and humanistic import of physics were undergoing a profound transformation. So as David Kaiser points out in How the Hippies Saved Physics, by the mid-1970s, the counterintuitive weirdness of relativity and quantum physics were only then finally being felt in physics, prompting a foundational reassessment of its basic assumptions. He identifies a tough job market for recent physics grads in the mid to late 20th century, paired with a broad countercultural suspicion of weaponized, self-replicating institutional dogma as drivers of generational change within physics and its cultural imaginary. At stake for Kaiser is a methodological shift from conservative lines of inquiry, comfortable generating definite results at the expense of a limited scope of applicability, to more high-risk speculative endeavors. Just to give one example, the Berkeley Fundamental Physics Group, FY Physics Group, also founded in 1975, attempted to use quantum fluctuations to communicate with spirits, and maybe even for the purpose of telecommunication. Fridtjof Capra's 1975 The Tao of Physics, another contemporary example of this shift, pushes back against the ostensible separation of spirit from matter, Cartesian dualism, which he argues has accompanied Western science throughout its development. The shape of the physical phenomena investigated during the 20th century prompts instead a reconsideration of the formalism of physics away from dualism and instead towards a conception of the profound interconnectedness of all physical phenomena, including those of mind and spirit. In the way that Einstein on the Beach oscillates between figures of excessive constraint and explosive release, it charts these contemporary developments and how ideas from physics were interfacing with and circulating within popular discourse. I have in mind two particular dialectics that the opera navigates, one between creativity and destruction, and the second between brilliance and insanity. I'll just show you a few clips about how I see these as working. If you're a physicist, you might be intimately familiar with these elevators. These are the elevators that Einstein asks us to imagine in his thought experiment justifying the equivalence principle. One of them moves up and down, the other one moves left to right on axes within a frame that you may or may not recognize as a Minkowski diagram. So if you imagine the vertical axis is time, the horizontal axis is space, and there's a 45-degree line representing how light traverses that geometry. So the staging of this work is really keenly interested in all of the innovations of Einsteinian physics. But where it ends up, where it takes us to ultimately, of course, is nothing more than destruction, the atomic bomb. This is a trope that reoccurs in many different places throughout the work of violence suddenly inserting itself surprisingly and almost comically out of nowhere. In this particular scene, this gun appears and then within a matter of 5 seconds is gone and completely forgotten. So there's this strange dialectic between genius and between the brilliance of the physics and the utter destructive potential contained within it. At the same time, between genius and insanity. So if you're a physics student, you might sympathize with this. These are possibly anesthetized students who are overcome with the enormity of some equations. At the same time, the choir has taken to brushing their teeth while singing the chorus lines. And of course, we all recognize the iconic mad scientist image, which is rehearsed in this play. This, of course, would warrant its own talk, but I'll just mention one other example of this. This is Dürrenmatt's Die Physiker, in which a scientist modeled on Einstein discovers the answer to the universe. And in order to prevent that answer from being utilized by the government for nefarious purposes, he pretends like he's gone insane and checks himself into an insane asylum. Einstein on the Beach makes no attempt to escape from the trap of mere sound and fury signifying nothing, nor does it attempt to revindicate the unsavory consequences of 20th century physics. What it offers instead is an invitation to partake in the full capaciousness of physics, that physics can be both creative and destructive, brilliant and absurd, meaningful and meaningless, are not contradictions to be resolved, but rather generative tensions within a world so profoundly inflected by scientific ideas and institutions that we ourselves have little other option but to improvise our own dance to its furious tune. I want to close with what I think is one of the work's most subtly brilliant depictions of relativity. So this is a scene that lasts for about 15 minutes towards the end. I think it's the third to last scene of the play. There's a bar of light that slowly rotates upwards. So here again, I think this is borrowing from the metaphorics of the Minkowski diagram of space, of the axes of space and time rotating depending on how you move through them. There's something I think even much more interesting going on here. Maybe even a visual illusion. So I'm going to ask you to first consider the question, is this rod of light straight or is it curved? I think you'll come up with a different answer depending on how you look at it. If you focus on the rod of light hard enough, I think you can convince yourself it's straight. And indeed, it does seem to be straight in later iterations. But if you do that, you're left with the illusion that the stage itself is curved, that it's sloping off towards the left. You can do the opposite. You can imagine that the stage itself is flat. If you just stare at the reflection of the light on the ground, at least for me, maybe I've stared at this too long, at least for me, I'm left with a sense that the bar of light is very slightly curving. Obviously, there's no right answer. The bar is both curved and straight, depending on how you look at it. But this is exactly the genre of paradox that relativity allows us to accommodate, the paradox of the incommensurability of perception registered from different vantage points. Einstein on the Beach famously has no beach. This seems fitting for a work so deeply engaged in Einsteinian physics, which invites us to imagine a world in which time and space bleed effortlessly to each other, a world without stable categories of energy or mass, but still replete with being. Crucially though, neither the physics nor the opera is interested in eliding difference or collapsing distinctions just for the fun of it. They're not, as Hollinger might charge, fleeing from the complications of our contemporary political situation. What Einstein on the Beach foregrounds instead is the irreducibility of difference, the centrality of our own idiosyncratic path through the work and through the world itself in constructing its basic fabric. So it's not, in other words, the incommensurable worlds themselves of land and water, physics and art, motion and stillness, meaning and nonsense that Einstein celebrates, but rather the dynamism of the interface between them, the obdurate and omnipresent reality of the locus of their separation. Thanks for listening, and I'm really eager to hear your thoughts and your questions.
Thank you for this very interesting insight into this opera. And now we have Cora Övermann. She's a doctoral student at the Bremen University, and she's also associated with the research network Fiction Meets Science. And her presentation is the literature part of our panel, and the title is Charming Money from the NIH, Capitalism and Competition in Contemporary US Science Novels. Cora, the floor is yours.
Yes, thank you, Anna, for that very kind introduction. Thank you to the organizers in general. I'm very much enjoying being here and sharing my screen now. Also honored to be the final girl, so to speak. Okay, so let's just jump right in. The title has already been mentioned. This is going to be the structure of my presentation, which is pretty straightforward, starting with a short introduction, moving on to what actually are science novels, what we're talking about, then 3 examples from the corpus I've selected, some conclusions, and of course, my sources. So nowadays, there's lots of research on the culture of science, which is getting pretty tough and pretty competitive, which is why this is about competition and capitalism. So Hugh T. Crawford, for example, has stated that nowadays, instead of doing research, a disproportionate amount of time spent by scientists involves shuffling a lot of paper as they try to get their next project funded, because without funding, as a scientist, you can't do anything pretty much. So you don't have a research lab, you couldn't pay your postdocs, and you also couldn't keep up with the newest equipment. So funding really is essential in this case. Since we're talking about the US, there are two major institutes that scientists can get funding to. One of those is the National Science Foundation, short NSF, and the other one are the National Institutes of Health, short NIH, which are also in the title. However, the problem here is that as applications have increased, the amount of available funding has pretty much stayed exactly the same, which means that now competition is much more fierce for the funds that are available. And so the proposal success rate goes down in the process of this. We see that it was in this graph at 18.3%. The latest number that I was able to find from NIH was from May 2021, and it's now at 20.6%, which means that only one application in 5 total is successfully funded, and that for every person that does get a grant, 4 other ones are turned down, which of course illustrates how competitive the situation is at the moment and how desperate scientists can get because there is so much pressure on them to succeed. So overall, this competitive situation has a lot of downsides for both scientists as well as the overall world of science. And I'm talking especially natural science here. So some side effects of that include the winner-take-all economics, which refers to the fact that in the natural sciences, only the team to publish their results first usually gets critical acclaim because science does not benefit from the same stuff being published twice, which then leads to publish or perish mentality, because also especially publications are now one of the most important factors in getting a promotion, in getting a new position. And so you have to publish first if you want to get the acknowledgement for that, because somebody else might also be faster. This whole stress of the situation, of course, leads to mental health problems, leads to scientists being less willing to share and cooperate on their work, leads to less creativity, which is one of the mental side effects. And in extreme cases, also scientific misconduct, which can refer to the falsification, fabrication, or plagiarism of results. And this is just a small selection of the possible side effects that competition and capitalism can have on science. So of course, this situation has not escaped authors of science novels. The genre as such came to be about the 1990s, and half of the authors of science novels actually are former scientists themselves who then write about their own experience. And science novels are not science fiction novels because they do not add fantastical elements. They are not set in the future. They can feature either fictional or historical characters, so play in the present or the past, but stick more to the science and make their own fiction out of that rather than being part of science fiction. One of the most defining features of contemporary science novels is that the representation of the scientist characters has fundamentally shifted. So of course, we've always seen scientists in fiction for decades and centuries, but stereotypically those were mad or evil inventors not in control of their creations. So the most famous one is Dr. Frankenstein, but of course Einstein would also feature into that. But nowadays, with more modern representations, especially in novels, we see more well-rounded characters who have relationships, who are integrated into society, not as socially awkward anymore. And so the portrayal of a scientist characters has shifted, but that does not mean that the portrayal of science overall is a more positive one, because now we do see new characters, but we also see how these new characters grapple with new problems. So by dealing with the pressure to publish or perish, for example, science novels make visible the internal organization of science, which the public usually would not have access to, and especially focuses on the bureaucratic and tedious aspects of research, the difficulties of establishing a career in science, and the underside of research financing, and as I have already mentioned, scientific misconduct, which can be one of the consequences of that. So that now scientists really are under a lot of pressure and stress in these science novels. And 3 of the novels that I am familiar with fit especially well into the topics of this presentation, which is why I have selected them. The first one of those is Carbon Dreams by Susan M. Gaines, which was published in 2001 and is set in the 80s in the US. The second one is Allegra Goodman's Intuition from 2006. And the third one, Anne Patchett's State of Wonder from 2011. And these are all, at least initially, taking place in the US or portraying the US. They are all also written by women authors. And so I considered including gender as an aspect in this presentation because it definitely further influences the culture and the climate of science. But I had to realize that talking about free science novels as it is was pretty ambitious. And so I have to leave out aspects of gender. Furthermore, they each feature different competitive aspects and they are all fairly contemporary. And so without further ado, we can move on to the inspection of these novels and see what they tell us about the culture of science, competition, and capitalism. So we start with Carbon Dreams and the subheader, There's Always Industry. Carbon Dreams is a novel about a young female researcher called Tina Arenas, who is a postdoctoral researcher at Brayton Institute of Oceanography in Northern California. For short, the institute is called BIO. Her disciplines are actually a mixture of different disciplines. So organic geochemistry is what we imagine as a mix of biology, geology, and chemistry, and that's where her main interests are. However, at the beginning of the novel, Tina is in a very financially vulnerable position, I would say. So she uses a lab by another researcher who is on a sabbatical leave for 2 years, and she is faced with her old grant about to run out. So at the beginning of the novel, she has 6 months left, and she knows that this is getting tight to apply for a new grant from either NIH or NFS. And since scientists always need to be aware of the grant running out and are quite unsure about where the next funding will come from, they live with a constant sort of uncertainty and also anxiety. And so one of her friends points out to Tina that maybe it would be better to teach, because if you teach at a state university, you have a stable income, you have a stable position, you are safe in a sense. But Tina points out if she does teach at a university, then she wouldn't even have a lab to use. There would be no research. All she would do is teach, and that's not what she's interested in. But still, her friend replies that it's got to be better than soft money. And I don't see how you stand it, not knowing from one year to the next if you have a job. And the salary also isn't that great. So she points out the vulnerable position that Tina finds herself in. And I know that Anna says this yesterday, that there's no safety net in this research area. And that is also exactly what Tina's friend here says. It says, if you run out of funding, if your soft money gamble does not work out, the institute will not care. So they don't care if you end up unemployed or homeless. There's no safety measure for that gamble failing. So the pressure is on. And one of the ways to escape that pressure is to maybe leave the academic environment and move on to industry. But science novels in general, as I have found, are very fond of mainly trashing industry, because academia is seen as this scientifically pure and perfect environment. And so Tina also says, yeah, but who want to work for industry? Like, which scientist would voluntarily do that? And rather decides to submit a grant to the NSF, which is the first major grant proposal, and which gets then turned down, which is very unfortunate for Tina, because she had not seen it coming. She had not been prepared. She had no safety or alternatives lined up for that. And she especially wonders why it happened. And so one of her colleagues points out that maybe Tina, who pursued her own research interest, wasn't adept enough in aligning her research or her proposal with the interests of the people who actually give out the grants. So real scientists in the study by Anderson et al., for example, talk about how if you submit a grant, you always go looking to see who's on the study section first and write a bit towards what they do. So you have to consider who is giving me that grant and how can I subtly please them so that they will actually give it to me, which is of course manipulation of research that you're about to do, or at least involves having a narrative, like being able to sell what you want to do, making it about the story behind it as much as the research itself. And so the colleague that Tina is talking to also points out that since basic research now has to defend its existence on the same terms as applied research, scientists need to use task-oriented language. So they need to use the big words. They need to make it sexy in a way, or otherwise their application will get turned down. And Tina is outraged in her young 28-year-old firm belief that she wants to her structure of a proposal to adjust to what is being demanded of her. But her colleague assures her, you can still do your original work. Like, you can do exactly the same things that you were going to do before. You just need to dress them up a bit differently. So you have to move to the fore that what the people want to hear, but it doesn't mean that you can't do your own research anymore. You just need to be more strategic about it. And so that is what happens in the first novel. The second one, which is Intuition by Allegra Goodman, actually starts with a very similar situation to Carbon Dreams. So this novel is not about a single protagonist, but about a whole host of characters which are all associated with the Philpott Institute in Boston. But the four that I'm going to focus on, or rather the two, are the lab directors, Maria Mendelsohn and Sandy Glass, and then the two postdocs, Cliff Banneker and Robin Decker. And the discipline, which I put down a bit humorously here, is curing cancer, because that's what we're working on. But unfortunately, there are no results in the lab at the beginning of the novel. So the research that is being undertaken is not yielding anything that's favorable or publishable, so that here too the Institute is under a lot of pressure. And the lab director, Marion, surmises that they desperately need funding and pull together a resoundingly good grant proposal for NIH by April 1st, or contemplate folding. And they are in the same position as Tina, because they also know that there is no support coming in. So if they fail, that's it. That's a lab getting shut down. There is no financial aid coming from the director, because the director has other labs to focus on who might then be more successful. And so they really need something to work out. And when it does, when one of the postdocs does get surprising results, this is, of course, has great potential to save them from the situation that we're in. But still, the lab director, Marion, is hesitant about this, because results need to be replicated before you can really do anything with them. And she also knows that her co-director, Sandy, is so enthusiastic that he might not take the time to replicate the results, because before he puts out the press release that they've cured cancer. And of course, the media also, which we might consider in their capacity here, they want to promote a story that cancer has been cured, so that also gatekeepers like the media and other reviewers might not be as rigorous about a kind of story which promises that cancer have been cured. For example, we have the same thing now with the COVID pandemic, with vaccines that are being developed very quickly because the public needs them. And so what sells well to the public in the current moment is also a consideration that goes in here. And Marion's husband further points out that Sandy is a terrific publicist and a great fundraiser who can charm money from the NIH, which is the sentence which has inspired the title for this talk, but he might sometimes lose sight of a scientific truth in the process of being the first one to publish. And so Marion is hesitant about telling Sandy of these results, and it turns out that she was right to be hesitant, because as soon as Sandy finds out, he starts writing the new grant proposal, claiming it to be an utter masterpiece, writing the whole thing before he has the science to back it up. So he just leaves the figures blank, because you already know what he has to say, what kind of language and style he has to use. So he relates to the reader that language is important when it comes to winning large sums of money. So our keynote yesterday, Charles Adler, already talked about is how do we write science in a way that is appealing to readers and to other scientists. But here the consideration is how do we write science in a way that is appealing to the reviewers and to people sitting on a board giving out the grants. And so Sandy decides that if statements of purpose and declarations of intent would be polished to such a sheen, the reviewers would see themselves reflected in there, and presents himself as a poet of the NIH form. So he knows that getting the story out there is what it's all about. And gets into an argument with Marion about that because she says, okay, but let's still stay careful. We need to make sure that the results are there and that everything that we put out into the public is actually correct. And he says, yeah, we can do that, or we can also publish it now before somebody else does, because the pressure is on, because there are bigger and financially more wealthy labs who might be able to do the same research much, much faster. So what features into here is the fear of being scooped, of being beaten to the punch. And since we have the winner-take-all economics, that is a very real risk in science that is being represented here. And so in the end, it turns out that they do publish results that are slightly falsified, and they did get the grant, but now they have to pay it all back and also take back the publication because the science behind it wasn't solid. And then coming to my last example of the day, State of Wonder by Patchett, is a very different situation initially from the first two novels, which is why it's a great counterexample. Here, the two characters that I would like to focus on are Dr. Marina Singh, who is our protagonist, and her former mentor, Dr. Annick Swenson. Dr. Marina Singh is sent from her initial location in Minnesota to the middle of the Amazon to track down Dr. Swenson because Dr. Swenson has mysteriously disappeared and is no longer in contact with the company which funds her research, which is Vogel. And here the research discipline is biochemistry, so drug development. A fertility drug is supposed to be developed. And I say it's very different from the other two novels because here it's not about getting the funding. The funding is already there to a huge extent. The problem is here what is being done with the funding. So as I said, Dr. Swenson has pretty much dropped off the face of the earth and cannot be tracked down in the middle of the Amazon. And the funding is still pouring in because, as Marina observes here, if she were just checking in, Vogel, the company, would leave her in a research station for years, pouring in cash from an open vein. So here we have an abundance of funding being available. Furthermore, the company might then consider, okay, we're keeping up the cost of having a research team down in the Amazon, but it's nothing against the potential benefits of this fertility drug being developed because it's supposed to cater to Western or American women, and the interest of being fertile for years and years and years beyond the natural biological age is of course huge. It's a huge capitalist or financial interest. However, as with the other novels, here we have the same issue of scientists shuffling a lot of paper before they can do their research. So when Marina finds Dr. Swenson, one of the things she tells her is that she has been down in the Amazon for 10 years, and a third of that, so the first 3 years, was spent piecing together grants for research, which was very time consuming. Also, as with intuition, Dr. Swenson is initially, or for a very long time, very, very secretive about what research she is doing because she does not want other research teams to get there or find them. And she has a whole list of terrorists who might show up, which include drug dealers, the Brazilian government, other tribes, and German tourists. And there's absolutely no telling which one of those is her worst case scenario. So she decides to keep her research very secret. And it turns out that she's partly doing that because she's not only working on a fertility drug, she's also working on a malaria vaccine because she found out that the complex ecosystem she's working on actually offers a way to do both. And so as a scientist, she has to have a go at it. But she cannot tell this to the company which is funding her because they might withdraw the funding when they find out what she's actually doing because that's not what they signed her up for. She then points out that the people who really need a malarial vaccine will never have the means to pay for it. So she doesn't really see the harm in using an American pharmaceutical company to do her malaria research, but she very much doubts that this company would be willing to foot the bill for what she calls first world do-gooding. And so this is a different kind of ethics coming and seeing that the funding is there, but what do you do with it? Do you make sure that women can have children indefinitely, or do you try to find a cure for malaria and save hundreds of lives? Okay, so after these three very different examples with a very different definitions and takes on ethics, I would like to come to my conclusions for these three novels. I think I've made clear that each of them present both the pressure that scientists are under, present aspects of capitalism and competition quite clearly, and tackle ethics in different ways. What they don't do is they don't really give us an answer. They don't say this is the right thing or the wrong thing to do. That's up for the reader to decide. What they do give us is different kinds of narratives. So first, a narrative about scientists, which is much more sympathetic than what we had before. And of course, also an insight into how these scientists themselves use narrative, use storytelling to get ahead with their research. And so that overall, the scientist here in these depictions is no longer the problem, is no longer either the monster or the creator of the monster. Instead, the new monster in these novels, I would say, is the capitalist Western society. And that concludes my talk. Thank you very much. Just a look at the sources.
Thank you, Cora, for your as well very interesting presentation. And I think we can move on to the questions. And while the public maybe can come up with something, I can just maybe break the ice with a question for both. As it's a bit of a two opposites question. So I could see that in Tyler's presentation, he's highlighting how this text is tackling the abstract parts of what it could be a narrative about Albert Einstein, and it is addressing paradoxes that are intrinsic to physics and to this kind of physics in particular that we find hard, even when even how Charles was saying yesterday, it's kind of hard to give a reader or a viewer a clear sense of what's going on unless they are into it. While on the other hand, we had your novels, Cora, that seem to address very concrete issues and to depict in a very practical way some problems that scientists seem to face when they are working. So I was just wondering how these two very different kinds of texts are accessible to the public. Of course, it's two very different texts. And I wonder, in the case of Einstein on the Beach, does this actually manage to convey the ideas, the perspective that was intended? And I think, of course, it's very interesting how the physics can get, in a way, conveyed and channeled through movement, as you were saying, through music, through this construction of the stage, that anyway, maybe the regular spectator cannot quite grasp how sophisticated the transposition is. And for Cora, do you think that who is the reader, the ideal reader for these novels? I mean, it's someone that can, in a way, anyway, has some kind of familiarity with the field, or it can be a whatever reader and they learn about the concrete aspects through the novel. So this more or less is my question, if it makes sense to you.
Yeah, it totally makes sense to me. I'm just gonna get started. I think the two presentations are so different because one of them is trying to convey the content of science, so concept of physics, and the other one is trying to convey the culture of science, so everything that is around it. And of course, we're also talking about two different media. Tyler will have to reply to if viewers actually get all the physics concepts behind that. Let's start with what the public actually gets from those presentations. Is that I think they get a view behind the big veil, behind the wall of a laboratory that science takes place in these science novels, because it's usually something, or used to be very secretive, and still nowadays it's something that the public can't really picture or doesn't really think about. But I do think that these novels are written for the ordinary reader, so they're both educational as much as they are an entertainment product. So they very much keep a balance between science input, criticizing the culture of science, but also offering entertaining aspects, offering relationships and the whole lot of human drama, so that everybody can enjoy that. And then maybe you skip over the heavily scientific passages, but there is still a novel as much as other novels are. So I would say that the ideal reader is curious, but does not have to be overly educated for that.
I'll just add, maybe this is a question that I think is a particularly interesting one to pose with regards to science. I think with both science and art and literature, you have some relationship between the process of actually writing or constructing something and the outcome. It seems like that relationship is especially skewed in one direction in the case of science. So, you know, Einstein is E equals mc squared to most people, and that elides this vast body of everything else that went on to get there. Whereas with music, for instance, even people who aren't necessarily trained in classical music, I think can get a lot of the interesting things that Philip Glass is doing. That's not to say that one is better than the other, or one is more complicated than the other, or anything like that. It's just that maybe there's more of the process. The process is perhaps more manifest in the finished product in something like music and literature. As far as actually digging into that process side, the abstraction in a work like Einstein on the Beach, I have to take recourse to one of our favorite quotes within physics, which is, I'm going to paraphrase Feynman, which goes something like, you know, the surest way to know if someone really understands quantum physics is if they don't pretend like they understand it. In other words, that to really get this stuff, you have to grapple with the fact that there's something just incomprehensible with them. I think that, which Feynman is right, is really a part of the scientific process these days. That confronting the inscrutably complicated, which I think Einstein on the Beach really does a great job of communicating. You're left, I've mentioned some critics who leave the Playhouse saying, what on earth was that? And in a sense, that's what it is. That's the point. I think that comes across very nicely. The other tidbits about Minkowski space and so on, I mean, those are just my interpretation. I'm not even sure if the creators intended those. But it's nice that it's amenable, at least, to that level of you know, detailed drawing connections to science.
Yeah, I guess I would say that maybe this specific opera could have some, I don't know, as Einstein is, I guess everybody knows Einstein, you know, even people that have absolutely zero knowledge of whatever physics he might have been about, but everybody knows Einstein. So I guess that to an extent, maybe I'm just wondering for the public, it could be, I don't know, a part of the alienation you encounter when you're watching this opera, as people might think that this is going to be about Einstein, you know, this is going to be about, it's going to be a narrative about his life in some way, but then you're just watching stuff happening in this opera, and there isn't really, I don't know, a progression that is clear, and that you can say, yes, we went from here to there, and now it's the conclusion in a way, right? So probably that's also, you think, a bit alienating for people, especially if it's people that do not know about physics, of course, because you know, if you can draw something metaphorical even from what you've seen, of course you can understand it better, and you might think, oh yes, this resonates with what I know about Einstein. But normal non-specialized public, I guess, might be, I don't know, alienated, thinking that it's going to be something about a popular character, a popular persona, and it's not really going to be.
Yeah, I think you're certainly right. I haven't actually viewed this work in real life. I've only seen recordings of it. But what I've read from people who have seen it is that all sorts of reactions are possible. Some people, I think, walk away just saying that was ridiculous, you know, maybe even like turned off from the science side of it. Other people, on the other hand, say that was spectacular. I want to go read a bunch of physics now. I think what they are aiming for, it's in the title already, Einstein on the beach, is that they're really thinking a lot more about Einstein as a popular figure, a little bit less so about the science, even though, of course, given my background, I was more interested in that personally. But Einstein is a pop cultural phenomenon as much as he is.
Yeah, absolutely.
I think that actually links really well to the panel that I attended last night about scientists, representation, and gender, because Einstein is so popular that if somebody says draw a scientist, many of them will draw somebody who looks like Einstein, so who is male, white, middle-aged. And that, of course, puts a huge shade on people of color or on women who are still underrepresented in science. So I just wanted to also throw that in there.
Yeah, I mean, maybe if we don't have any further question, maybe we can just close with you can say something about gender, as you picked 3 novels that were that had characters that were females, and how does that relate to the kind of novel, and how does that really shine through the narrative, or is just, you know, putting a female character because I want to have a female scientist?
Yeah, I'd be very happy to talk about that, since my whole dissertation is mainly going to be about gender. So I have a bigger corpus than the 3 I came here today with, but gender is an aspect in those novels, especially, as I said, if we consider not only the scientific career and challenges which are due to gender are definitely being presented here. So what comes in as another factor is also age. So the younger you are as a female researcher, the more you struggle kind of until you found your place. But it's not just the career, it's also especially interpersonal human relationships, the aspect of romance coming in, which of course entertains the reader and keep their interest, but also raises another gender struggle of, is this person going to be able to pursue their career as they like, or are they eventually going to decide to settle down and have children instead? And so those are aspects of being explored, the traditional gender expectations of being a minority in still natural sciences. How do people treat you? Do they address you as Dr. Andrews, or do they say, oh, the young lady in the center over there also has a question? So yes, that is very clearly being addressed in these 3 novels, and I enjoy dealing with that a lot.
Can I add just a small follow-up question? Some of the things that you mentioned, particularly about publish and perish, financial precarity, of course, are shared broadly across academic fields. I'm wondering if any of the novels that you read point out specific problems that are unique to science, or whether they make connections to similar sorts of things, not exactly the same, but similar things that people go through in social sciences and humanities and so on, whether they're also regards to questions of gender.
Actually, rarely. So the novels that I focus on are exclusively STEM disciplines. So I only get into the so-called hard sciences. So there's not much comparison to other disciplines, but that could also occur, but the gender bias and the competition in especially the natural sciences and STEM fields is disproportionately high. So in social sciences, we have lots and lots more women. We even have gender differences within the different disciplines. So biology, for example, is more popular with women, whereas maths and physics are the most male-coded disciplines. So we could differentiate between that maybe, but not so much between disciplines. Yeah.
Perfect. Thank you. I think this was a very good reflection to somehow wrap up our conference as well, not just this panel, as you were saying, it kind of sums up a bit some other panels that we had this week. So thank you very much. It was two very good presentations, and thanks to the public who have resisted until now at the end of the conference. And thank you again.
Thank you too.
Thank you.